Ditayangin natin. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Okay, let's start our agenda with reciting Basmalah together. The Honorable Deputy Dean Dr. Dias Dewanti, the Honorable the Head of Economic Study Program from NSC, the Honorable Secretary of Economic Study Program of International Program, Dr. Dimas Baguspiranata Kusuma, the Honorable Lecturer from Universitas Gadjah Mada, Bapak Angga Susanto, the Honorable Lecturer of Economic Study Program, Prof. Lilis, and all college, the Honorable guests, ladies and gentlemen, all students and virtual audience at Zoom and Economic Study Program YouTube channel. Today, we will have an international seminar with outstanding speaker from Matthew S. Winters, from the Department of Political Science, University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Thank you, Prof. Matthew, for coming. Before we proceed to the next agenda, let's view Prof. Winters' CV. Prof. Matthew S. Winters, he is professor at the Department of Political Science, University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. His contact information is email at winters@illinois.edu. His research interests foreign aid, development, corruption, Indonesia, Brazil. His education, political science, PhD, Columbia University. His additional campus affiliations, Professor Center for Global Studies, Affiliate Center for Social and Behavioral Science, Professor Center for East Asia and Pacific Studies, Professor Lehman Center for Brazilian Studies, Professor Center for African Studies, Professor Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies. He has authored publications, his recent publication in 2022, Corruption, Victimation, and Anti-Monopoly, Government College of Social Rights as Political Knowledge. And then 2021, Foreign Aid and Quality of Government, the Oxford Handbook of Quality of Government, Oxford. And Before we hear his outstanding lecture, we will have the welcoming speech from our dean, Dr. Diaz Yowanti. To Dr. Diaz Yowanti, the time is yours.
Um, Thank you. Yes. And to welcome also Professor Matthew and University of Illinois. And then Honorable Dr. Peter, the lectures from Gajah University, Honorable Professor Dr. Lady Setialiti, Buditis, also Honorable Buditis. He's totally my sister, so sometimes I forgot her title. Sorry. Dr. Beatrice Kusumawan. And also all the participants here, I see from Turkey, from Malaysia, I'm saying that all around the world. All around the world, also from the our future magister economics students. I still say the so thank you for having here, and thank you, Professor Matthew. I think this is the first time we came to UMY, right? And hopefully not only the first time, becoming the first time, but it will be a second time, third time for next collaborations and also visiting lectures. And I think I saw already Pak Dimas, I also Dr. Dimas. So because he's mixing with the student, I thought that he's a sorry, Pak Dimas. So today is very a warm and a great moments that we have guest lectures from Professor Matthew concerning the political economy of accountability. It's also important not only for the students but also for the lecturers because we need to update it, develop our knowledge, and also wants to know another scholars. So today is not only for the students but also for the lecturers. So it will be probably it's only once, but we will have another ones, another things with Professor Matthew, whether it will be online or offline. So hopefully this event will be run smoothly and Java. And I think without wants to prolong our sessions, and we already have our lectures in here. So thank you for all of your coming. Hopefully you're joining here and like having a lot of knowledge concerning political economics. Thank you so much and welcome to Professor Matthew.
Thank you very much, Dr. Diaz for the warm welcoming speech. Let's continue our agenda with international seminar. Now, Professor will deliver his lecture entitled "The Political Economy of Accountability. What are the consequences of accountability failures of economic growth?" Professor will have 1 hour lecture, probably 1.5 hours, and continue with Q&A sessions. Without any further delay, to Prof. Matthew as speakers, the time is yours.
Thanks to everyone for your hospitality and the opportunity to share some of my thoughts with you on accountability and the effects of accountability. I encourage you to feel free to ask questions. I know that's not the standard procedure maybe, but John Kawatir, Tanya, you can feel free to ask if you have any questions along the way or don't understand something that I've said. I'll begin just by telling you a little bit about me and that research in particular. If you'd like to ask questions during the Q&A, I'd be happy to answer at that time. And then I'll provide a definition of accountability, and I'll use that definition to describe some accountability problems that we might encounter. I'll talk about the role that information plays in accountability, and then I will transition to a conversation about economic growth with a little bit of basic economic growth theory, and then how should we think about institutions in terms of promoting economic growth? How do we think about this key institution of democracy? And if I haven't gone on too long, we can talk about some of the potential obstacles to accountability, which is the obstacles to citizens that aren't really engaging with institutions related to finance. That's me with two of my recent PhD students. So I did all of my studies at Columbia University in New York City, and then I've been faculty at the University of Illinois, which is in the center of the United States. That's 2009. And the associate head for graduate studies there. I advised a large number of graduate theses and undergraduate theses as well. I started studying accountability in graduate school with a series of essays in my dissertation on the topic of foreign aid and accountability relationships in foreign aid. So I had a theoretical paper about the likelihood of corruption in aid projects, under what conditions would there be more accountability and therefore less corruption. I had an empirical paper about the way in which the World Bank designs aid projects in order to increase accountability in certain situations. And then I came to Indonesia for the first time in the spring of 2007. And what ended up happening during my time here was that I wrote a paper about one World Bank funded development intervention in Indonesia, the water supply and sanitation for low-income communities project, also known by its Indonesian acronym Pamasima, looking at which villages received funding under that projects. One of the papers that I published out of my dissertation research was a study of corruption in development projects. So I spent a lot of time reading World Bank project documentation and looking for signs of corruption. And I found that where projects were more precisely targeted, where the intended beneficiaries in the aid project were clearer, there was less likely to be corruption than in projects that were nationwide or targeted a broader sector of the population. So the theory here was that better targeting would lead to better accountability, would lead to less corruption, and that is what the data showed was happening. These are a series of papers that I wrote with John Gould from Colorado College, looking at one particular World Bank intervention, the Chad Cameroon Pipeline project, where the World Bank wanted to increase accountability in the country of Chad, and we looked to see how successful it was at doing that. It was not very successful, unfortunately. We looked at some of the reasons why and some of the challenges for an international actor to promote accountability. With Rebecca White Shapiro, I've done a lot of research on how voters think about corruption and how they react to corrupt political candidates. A lot of that work has taken place in Brazil. Also some research in Argentina and the United States on this topic. And most recently, I brought together this public opinion research about what citizens or voters think, and my work on foreign aid to think about how foreign aid might interfere with accountability relationships, the way in which the presence of foreign aid projects might undermine people's relationship with their own governments. So that's some of the research that I've done. I'm happy to talk about any of that. If you have questions, if you'd like to engage with me later about it. But I'm going to mostly be talking about other people's research today and talking about what is accountability, what's the basic framework that we might use for thinking about accountability, and then what do we know about the impacts of accountability or the context in which we observe more or less accountability. So the word accountability in English traces back to William I of England, who in the 11th century, 1085, required all of the property owners in his kingdom, and what was at that time England, to give a count of the land that they possessed. So the king wanted information from his subjects and demanded this information from them. So we had an instance of upward accountability to the sovereign. Today, we mostly think of how to keep sovereigns accountable to the citizens, how to keep rulers accountable to the people. But the first use of this concept was the other way around. The first use of this concept was a king who wanted an account of what his subjects were doing, what people living under the king's rule were doing. This is a definition of accountability that comes from the work of Mark Bowman. He says that accountability is a specific social relation, and it is a relationship between an actor and a forum, where the actor has an obligation to explain and justify their conduct, their behavior, and the forum can therefore pose questions to the actor in order to get those explanations and justifications. And depending on the quality of those explanations and justifications, the forum may be able to put in place consequences for the actor, may be able to sanction the actor if they are dissatisfied with the explanations and justifications that the actor has provided. So we can take that basic framework or relationship between an actor and the forum, and we can think about some specific examples. So we might think of an employment relationship in a business. There's a boss and there's an employee. The employee is supposed to do some job. The boss can say, why did you do this? Why didn't you do this other thing? And the employee is required to provide explanations or justifications. And in the event that the boss is dissatisfied with those explanations or justifications, the employee may face consequences. They might get fired, they might lose wages. That would be an instance of accountability. We might think about accountability to a legal system. So if someone has allegedly broken a law, they're accused of a crime, they might be brought as an actor in front of a forum, which is a court, and they might be asked to explain and justify their action. And then depending on the quality of those explanations and justifications, they might face consequences. They might be held accountable for some action that is judged inappropriate, some behavior that is judged inappropriate under the prevailing legal standards in a community. So that would be another type of accountability. And then the type of accountability that I mostly think about and that I'll mostly be talking about is the accountability relationship between voters and elected officials. And so voters should be able to ask for explanations and justifications from elected officials as to why the government has done something or failed to do something, why economic performance has been good or bad. And then depending on the quality of the explanations and justifications that the elected official has provided, voters have the opportunity in these periodic events we call elections to enforce consequences against the elected official, that they might vote the elected official out of office, or they might return the elected official to office, so there's a positive consequence. We can start from that basic accountability relationship of elected officials to voters to think about governments as a chain of accountability relationships. And so this is the most basic accountability relationship in a democracy. It's not the elected officials who are actually doing a lot of the work, right? There's a bureaucracy that those elected officials are essentially overseeing. And so we can think about a chain that goes from an elected politician to the relevant minister, the minister of health, minister of education, minister of land. And then the minister, in turn, oversees the work of street level bureaucrats. So government is a chain of accountability relationships because the voters have delegated to the elected official responsibility for overseeing those bureaucrats that are doing the work of government. And so the top bureaucrat, like a minister, is overseeing a series of lower level bureaucrats. And in each case, there's this opportunity to ask for explanations and justification of actions and to enforce consequences if those explanations and justifications are not satisfactory. Using this very basic model of how to think about accountability, we can identify some accountability problems. Where are places that accountability is not occurring or is not being enforced? So one possibility is that our actor that's supposed to be responding to a particular forum actually is responding to multiple principles. And so we like to think under the democratic system that elected officials are primarily accountable to voters, but very often there's another actor that is asking elected officials to pay attention to that. And so we might use the general and special interests to refer to lobbying groups, to refer to businesses, to refer to particularly powerful individuals who, by virtue of perhaps providing money to elected officials, can make them accountable here, and therefore injure or hinder the accountability relationship over here. And that would be an accountability problem if we think that this is the primary accountability relationship that we want to see in a democratic setting. Sue Stokes has a great term referring to systems where there's a lot of clientelism or a lot of money politics of elected officials providing particularistic goods to voters. She talks about perverse accountability, where instead of elected officials facing consequences from the voters, then maybe voters face consequences from the politicians, the elected officials, because elected officials are asking voters to vote for them, and if the voters fail to do that, then maybe they won't give them money, they won't give them other goods that they have promised them, and that's not the way that the democratic system is supposed to work. So it's told us that would be a perverse outcome, it would be perverse accountability to see voters accountable to politicians rather than politicians accountable to voters. Another potential accountability problem is that the questions that different actors along this long chain of accountability are asking might be about different things. So our public, one thing that they might hear about government delivering is quality education. And so our voters might ask if their elected officials are our children being well educated. Are children getting the skills in school that they need to meet with success at the university level, that they need to meet with success in their professional careers in the future. But maybe what's happening later down the chain of accountability is that the bureaucrats are being held accountable for whether a school got built, that's part of education. But that's not the same as whether or not the children actually got educated, right? This is a piece of infrastructure that contributes to education. It isn't the same as education. And so it might be that here, what voters really care about is outcomes or impacts, but what the bureaucracy gets assessed for and held accountable for is outputs.
Excuse me, what do you mean about the voters? Because, maybe in the voice in our government.
Voters in public.
In the public.
Yeah, so voters who have the periodic opportunity in elections to hold elected officials accountable by voting them out of office.
Maybe in his, sorry, if I interrupt.
No,
During the.
I asked him.
In all the country, I think they have the different political system, right? And in regional level, for example, in Kabupaten Indonesia and in the province and also in the national level. And each level in Indonesia, the voters of the people then being represented by our government.
Yeah.
In lower level in the DPRD, then DPRD in the province level and also in national. So because it is a very different, so I think the minister then depend on the voters and our government. Yes.
Yeah.
I confused about the voters here.
Yeah.
People said that it is a people, yeah, but I think it is there's no easy for Indonesia, that the public opinion and then directly accepted by the government because we have the political change. In the lower is the DPRD in the regional and also the province and also in national.
Yes.
And after that, then with the government and the national level, then communication in the ministry.
Yeah, so the minister here is very general, so the minister here could be the head of the at the Kabupaten level. I don't necessarily mean that minister here, think of it as, high level bureaucrat, low level bureaucrat. The idea is just to present a chain of accountability.
The state level bureaucrat, this is in the regional level.
This is general, so it could be wherever you want, but I want a street level bureaucrat typically be somebody that a citizen is interacting with.
Okay, yes, we have the people opinion and then ranks by the government using the forum in Indonesia named that Musmenbang. Musyawarah Perencanaan Pembangunan in the village level, then in the district level, and also at the regional and province and in the level of national.
Yeah.
But not all the people opinion then accepted by the parliament in the lower and the province and also in the national. Yes.
Yeah, sure. So I think you're getting at, you'll see in a couple of slides, some of the challenges to holding governments accountable is that governments occurs at multiple levels. So how do you know who to hold accountable? And yes, voters are not necessarily good at distinguishing who has responsibility for particular outcomes that they care about. And so this model, right, is intended to be a generic model of government. And then it helps us to diagnose accountability problems like the types that you're pointing out, that someone may be uncertain. Is this a responsibility of the Kabupaten government? Is this a responsibility of the national government, or is this responsibility of the politician?
Yeah, but I think that every country have the political political rules. That maybe it is very different. It's image and the country in the world, right? Yeah. So I think do you study about our political in Indonesia?
I know it was.
Yeah.
Detail.
Yes, we have the, I think, Indonesia have the political system is a very different than other countries.
Yeah, I think this is a general law, however, that can apply wherever there are democratic elections.
Yeah, but in the implementation, it is very far with the theory. For example, about the presidential rule in Indonesia, that's someone who will election as the president can have to 20% of vote in the parliament.
Yes.
It is not easy.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I mean, my goal right now is not to talk about Indonesia, it's to talk generally. But, so I'm not sure, maybe it would be better to wait until Q&A and discuss Indonesia a bit more. But I do think that, yeah, the elite level politics in Indonesia interfere with this relationship. And so having a general model that tells us what government could look like under an abstract understanding of accountability helps us identify those obstacles to accountability.
Yeah, and so the system then will impact on the accountability in each project that held by the government, right? Yes, not only and domestic, and also the project that's financed by foreign country.
Yeah, so that's very much been the focus of my most recent research is exactly this interactivity between foreign aid and domestic governance. This is in Uganda primarily, also a little bit in Bangladesh. So, using this model of accountability to try to think through accountability problems, quoting here from a book by Adam Jaworski, Stephen Stokes, Bernard Manning, and they say governments are accountable if voters can discern whether governments are acting in their interests and sanction them appropriately. And they are interested in representation and define particular type of representation. Is that representation brought about by good accountability relationships? And that will occur when voters vote to retain the incumbent only when the incumbent acts in their best interest and the incumbent achieves policies necessary to get re-election. The key thing I want to draw our attention to here is this idea of voters being able to discern, that is, being able to understand, being able to know whether or not governments are acting in their interests. And so, exactly as our conversation here points out, a major constraint on the ability of voters to hold politicians accountable is the fact that politicians have a lot more information than voters do. So the things that politicians know, they know what policies have actually been passed. Voters may or may not have that information. The politicians know how much effort they've put in and how hard did they work. Whereas voters have no way of observing the extent to which politicians have been putting in effort. Politicians have more information on the effort of other actors. In this delegation chain from elected politicians through government bureaucracies, politicians have a better sense than voters do of how much effort bureaucrats have put in. And so this is a question of responsibility. That a politician knows, is it the common government that's in charge, or is it the consolidation, or is it the national government? Whereas voters are unlikely to know that. This is also the structure of the decision-making system. How did a policy come to be? Politicians know the structure of how a set of decisions is taken in order to get to a policy outcome, whereas voters don't know that. And then finally, politicians often have more information about the state of the world, about exogenous shocks to the world than voters do. And in a sense that politicians know if it's their own lack of effort that's led to bad outcomes, or rather to something outside of their control happen that has led to bad outcomes. So all of these things are limitations on voters' ability to really correctly question politicians and demand explanations and justifications, because they don't have complete information about all of these things. Is there any other questions on the basic model that I'm using here? I'm going to turn to some empirical results on information. So if anyone wants to ask about this basic relationship, now would be the time. So as I just said, voters don't fully observe the motivations or the actions of politicians, and citizens may also lack information about the state of the world or about the way that governance works. And then one thing to always keep in mind is the incentives of politicians are to claim credit for anything that's good and to deny responsibility for anything that's bad. Right? Politicians don't have incentives to take responsibility for bad outcomes or to deny responsibility for good outcomes. They only have incentives to claim credit for those things that are good, and that set of information problems that I just described is what makes it difficult for voters to know whether or not a politician's claim is justified. So a number of studies have tried to look explicitly at whether or not access to more information leads to better outcomes from government. I want to review a few of these papers for you, and the evidence is that if voters have more information, the government will actually work better, work more on their behalf. Besley and Burgess, the 2002 paper studying India, looking at the relationship at the state level, so within states, the equivalent of district in India. How does newspaper circulation, change in newspaper circulation over time, predicts the amount of emergency assistance being provided by states? So in scenarios where there's been a disaster, there's been floods, there's been droughts, there needs to be the distribution of emergency supply to people. In those states where there was greater penetration of media, do a better job of distributing those relief supplies. And what Besley and Burgess find is, yes, that increased newspaper circulation correlates quite strongly with more relief in the form of public food, and then more expenditures when there has been a disaster. Information essentially helps citizens to hold the government accountable. And so where more information is available in the form of newspapers, the government performs better, performs more in the interests of citizens. Similar results from a study in Uganda by Rebecca and Jakob Svensson. The World Bank in the 1990s, the mid-1990s, did a public expenditure tracking survey. So it looked at money that was coming from the central government, it was going to the local governments, it was supposed to reach schools at a local level. There were these school grants. And what they discovered in this public expenditure tracking survey was that only 24% of those grants coming from the central government were eventually getting schools. That 75% of the money was getting lost along the way. People were taking the money that they were supposed to be giving to schools. When this was revealed to the Ugandan government, what the Ugandan government did was that it began to publish in newspapers information about how much the schools were supposed to get. This very simple intervention led to a massive change in the amount of money that was actually reaching the schools. Went from 24% before the newspaper campaign, to 80% of the money getting into the schools after the newspaper campaign. And Ray and Spencer looked to see, was this change greater in those places that had better access to newspapers? So throughout Uganda, they mapped where newspapers were being sold. And then they studied the schools that were either in the communities where the newspapers were readily available, or they were in communities that were far away from that information. And what they found was that the farther the communities were from the newspapers, the lower the proportion of the funding that is reaching the schools in those communities. And then that had consequences for enrollments in those schools. Less money was reaching the school, fewer students were enrolling in the schools. Here's another look at that. So this is how much the school grants were associated with enrollment before the newspaper campaign, and then after the newspaper campaign. And so after the newspaper campaign, we see that those places closer to the newspaper outlets were enrolling more students because they were getting more money. Those levels of government in between the central governments and the schools, they become more accountable to their citizens because the citizens had more information. Here's a study from the United States that looked at this in the reverse direction. So if the rate of expensive study and the Bethany Burgess study were about increasing the amount of information, this is a study about information decreasing and the potential costs to accountability. Down in Murphy, they look at newspaper closures, and therefore the implied decrease in the ability of citizens to monitor their local governments in the United States. There's a map of where all the newspapers have closed for the time of their study. They looked at first how much these governments were paying to borrow money. So local governments in the United States often issue bonds in order to raise money, taking a loan from the public, from bond buyers, and they're going to compare those places where newspapers closed to places where there was no change. Their newspapers stayed open, or there was no newspaper to begin with. And what they're interested in seeing is after the closure, did those places that no longer have newspapers pay more or less to borrow money than those places that still had newspapers? So there are two different measures of that: the yield that they were paying on bonds, and then the relative yield relative to a baseline bond rate. So we care about differences between these two and these two. And what their results show is that in both cases, using either variable, after newspapers had closed, these places are paying more money than the places where there's no newspaper closure. So lots of information makes it harder for citizens to monitor the government and makes things more costly for the government. In addition to looking at bond yields, they looked at some other measures of government performance. How much were the governments paying people? How many people were they employing? How much tax were they collecting? And were they running budget deficits? Their expectations are that where there's less monitoring of the government, where there's less information available, the governments are going to overpay employees. I think I did that. The governments are going to overpay employees. They're going to have too many employees, and in order to do that, they're going to raise taxes. So we're just in the third row. What happens when newspapers close? And what these authors show is that when newspapers close, there's less citizen monitoring. Those governments start paying more, employing more people, and therefore they're taxing their citizens more, and they're increasing the size of their budget deficits. So Gowdy and Murphy take that as a sign of fiscal irresponsibility. poor government performance because there's now less information available to the citizens in those documents.
I'm sorry, sir. I think that's, you will talk about the, what are the consequences of accountability values for economic growth? What's, you tell us about the finding of the someone, right?
Yeah, we'll get to economic growth in the second half of the presentation. I mean, this presumably is symbolic of economic growth, right? That if these governments are performing poorly because of poor monitoring, that is going to increase local economic growth.
Okay, but in my mind, before I found this last year, I will talk about the accountability values of economic growth. In my mind, that's maybe we will talk about the inclusive or exclusive economic growth. And today we not only talk about the growth, but we talk about the sustainability. Yeah, because today there are many people in the world paid for the climate change and also it's all because of the black economics.
Yes, I mean, today it's involved is indicative of if people are concerned about sustainability, want to get more act on sustainability, then they probably need more information about what the government is doing, right? And so all three of these studies would say if citizens have some particular interest, right, if they want the government to execute that any intervention that is going to increase information should help people hold the government accountable for that interest. So sustainability, addressing climate change issues, equitable growth, any of those things, I think would be supported by this broad theoretical. So you've provided a transition. Let's talk about what we know about economic growth in order to start talking about economic growth. And move from information to institutions here. So this is a primer on economic growth theory. Some of you may already know a lot of this, but to bring everybody to the same level. Our most basic model of economic growth is the Solow growth model, where Solow tells us that this magical equation explains the proximate causes of economic growth. Y is a function of A, K, and an L. Y is output, production, so the goods and services that an economy is creating. K is physical capital. If we want to produce cars, if we want to produce food, we maybe need to build factories, put machines in those factories. And so the more that we add machines and factories to our economy, the more output we should get. Labor is L. If we have machines and factories, we need some humans, at least till the present day, to run those machines and factories. And so adding more labor to the system or improving the quality of that labor should increase our economic output. Before Solow, people had already thought in those terms. They thought in terms of adding capital and labor should create economic development. Solow's innovation and what makes the Solow growth model the basic model of economic growth in the present day is to emphasize technology, the A term. Solow says that capital and labor, yes, you need them and they are important, but the real gains to economic growth come less from adding capital and labor and more from improving the means of production or the organization of production. That A term is often called technology, sometimes called total factor productivity. That the A term tells us how well additions of capital and additions of labor lead to total economic output. So from the solo growth model, as I just said, we know that the economy will grow if the country increases the amount of investment in physical capital. That is, it builds new factories, it puts better machines into those factories. If it increases the amount of labor, which might happen because there's population growth, it might happen because there's immigration, it might happen because we create incentives for people to either join or remain in the workforce. And then we think about increasing the quality of labor. So training people to be better workers should lead to more output as well. And then, of course, Solo has told us the most important thing actually is to improve technology. And so the most growth will come from improvements in the A term, according to Solo. We can see some evidence from this. This is drawn from the textbook of the leading economic growth scholar of the current generation, Ron Moglu. Here is the relationship over time of how much countries have invested and their average economic growth rate. So over a 40-year period, those countries that invested more in physical capital grew at a higher rate than those countries that invested less physical capital. If we look at the quality of human capital, those countries that have higher levels of schooling, on average, they grew faster than those countries that had lower levels of schooling. And if we look at the A term, total factor productivity, those countries where there was a greater change in total factor productivity experienced higher overall growth rates than those countries where there was less of a change in total factor productivity. So the evidence supports Solo's theory quite well. And so bringing about economic growth is obvious, that all we need to do is invest in physical capital, invest in human capital to get better technology. The question is, well, how do we do those things? If these are the proximate causes of economic growth, what is it that facilitates improvements in in technology, capital, and labor? Ron Moglu, in his textbook, The Introduction to Modern Economic Growth, proposes four potential fundamental causes of economic growth. These are the proximate causes of economic growth. What fundamentally might cause economic growth? And Moglu says, well, maybe it's just one, not a very satisfying answer. Says maybe it's culture, harkening back to Weber and other classical social theorists who think that there is something about the Protestant work ethic in Northern Europe that led to the Industrial Revolution happening there. Maybe it's geography, that some countries are very limited from growing economically because of their geography, or maybe it's institutions. And Moglu is going to make strong arguments that the real fundamental cause of economic growth is high quality institutions. This is part of a more general institutional term in economics, starting with the work of Douglas North. Douglas North defines institutions as the rules of the game in society, the humanly devised constraints that shape human interactions, and that structure incentives and human exchange. This is where accountability comes back in. Structuring incentives and human exchange is about whether or not there are accountability relationships. Does accountability exist? So institutions affect incentives. And if we think about the Solo growth model, we can think about what types of institutions in particular might facilitate the addition of those proximate causes of economic growth to the system. Might facilitate the increase in capital, the increase in labor quality, the increase in technology. Here is a non-exhaustive list of good institutions. These are the types of institutions that Moglu was talking about when he says good institutions. So things like secure property rights, efficient bureaucracy, strong intellectual property rights, good bankruptcy law. It turns out that letting companies go out of business is important for economic growth. Having an impartial judiciary, having good corporate governance, then maybe the meta institution of democracy that Luke's colleagues will cite democracy as something that facilitates economic growth. We'll think about the way in which some of these institutions relate to the proximate causes of economic growth, summarized in this whole growth model, how they structure incentives for economic actors. So property rights, understanding who has the right to use property, physical land, or a factory, or you can even extend this to intellectual property, who has the right to profit from ideas. This lets people invest more. If you think your property is at risk, that it might be taken away by arbitrary government action, or that the government might fail to enforce your ownership rights over property, you're going to have less of an incentive to build a factory. You're going to have less of an incentive to improve the machines in your factory. And so if property rights are weak, we should see less investments and therefore less economic growth. If property rights are strong, a good institution, then we should see more investment, more economic growth. Here I am wearing the same shirt that I'm wearing today. My wardrobe hasn't expanded that much in 8 years, I guess. This is from a project in Mali where we were studying property rights and studying the use of the formal judicial system. So property rights need to be enforced. And therefore, another good institution might be an impartial judiciary that if disputes about investment, about ownership arise, will they be adjudicated according to the written law? Or will they be adjudicated because people are paying bribes to judges? Good institutions, if the courts enforce the written law, not so good institutions that people are able to pay off judges and get the decision that they want. Where you anticipate an impartial judiciary that rules according to the law, that should lead people to have more confidence about investing in capital or investing in new technologies. That should therefore increase the proximate causes of economic growth that Solo describes and lead to more growth in society. So the key idea of these good institutions is that they reduce uncertainty. If I feel like I have good property rights that are going to be protected by an impartial judiciary, then I have more incentives as an economic actor to invest in physical capital, to invest in technology, and even to invest my own labor in being productive. That I'm less uncertain about whether or not the government is going to take away something that I think I own, or other people are going to take away something that I think I own. And so this in part is the story about accountability, that an impartial judiciary can enforce accountability relations for those who violate property rights or intellectual property rights. An impartial judiciary can enforce accountability for bureaucrats who might misbehave, who might seek a bribe rather than giving out a license according to the written regulations. And then democracy can be seen as an institution that creates accountability for these other institutions. That if the judiciary is not performing well, the democratic system, there's the opportunity to complain about that by holding elected officials accountable for the failures of the judiciary. If bankruptcy law or corporate governance law is not well written, there's an opportunity to hold elected officials accountable for the shortcomings of that law. Any questions on the theoretical setup here before I show some empirical results?
Okay, you can explain more on how democracy, institution, and accountability they connect each other. For example, like in Indonesia, we have democracy is like maybe, and then, what about the country that has autocracy, mentioned child?
Yeah, so that's, I'll come back to democracy as a meta institution. I think the idea is that democracy is maybe in a category of its own, where by virtue of creating this relationship here of the citizens of a country having a mechanism, which is the mechanism of elections, for holding the government accountable, and then the government is supposed to hold on behalf of the citizens, the bureaucracy accountable. And that should create better types of institutions than what we would see in a system where this is not available. So if citizens don't have any way of holding the sovereign accountable, then we shouldn't be surprised when we see lower quality institutions of other types. We shouldn't be surprised when we see low quality bureaucracies, when we see courts that are not impartial, when we see that regulations either don't get written, when we see that property rights don't get enforced. So I like to think of democracy, as a meta institution that helps with other institutions function well.
That's my question. What the correction is, institutional or institutions. Institution refers to the in Indonesia is say lembaga, for example, government institution and so on. But if we using the terminology of institutional, I think it's very different. So in this term about the economic growth that will be success when the country have the good institution or institutional.
Yes, and North is very broad definition, right?
Because it is, I think that's a different meaning about institution and institutional. Institutional is relationship between more stakeholders to do something, maybe a project and so on. But institution is maybe like lembaga. This is
Yes.
office a lembaga.
Yes. So sometimes so again, I'm using North's understanding, which is extremely broad about institution. So I would sometimes use the language of agency in English to refer to like particular government.
Yeah, it is
agencies.
but it's not the same with the institutional. I think that's in the term of housing economic growth, not institutional, but institutional, not institution. Because that refers to a certain agencies.
Well, I mean, institutions are the rules of being in a society, or super broad. And then Masamoglu in co-op has got us a little more specific, but yeah, this North 1990 going forward is super broad. So that's, yeah, I would use agencies if we're talking about a particular government agency or a particular part of the bureaucracy. So since the mid-90s, people have been trying to study this relationship between the quality of institutions, again, broadly conceived, and economic growth. One of the first people to do this is Robert Barrow, who in this very influential 1996 book, it's a collection of lectures that he gave called The Determinants of Economic Growth. He shows, for instance, that in countries where the rule of law appears to be stronger, on average, they experience higher growth rates than in those countries where the rule of law appears to be somewhat weaker. Another study of this kind by Roderick, Subramanian, and Trevi, their paper is called Institution of Rule. They strongly want to make the argument that institutions are the most important determinants of level of development or sustained economic growth. And they're going to compare institutions to the level of trade integration and then the quality of geography of a country. They point out that one of the challenges of studying institutions is that they're likely endogenous to income levels, so meaning that countries at different income levels have different institutions. They might also be endogenous to trade integration or to geography, and it's hard to study things empirically that are endogenous. So we just look at the binary relationship between geography and then the level of development, so GDP per capita. We see that countries farther away from the equator tend to be wealthier, and that countries in the tropics tend to be poorer. We see that countries with high levels of trade openness tend to be wealthier, and that countries with low levels of trade openness tend to be poorer. And then countries with high rule of law, or good institutions, tend to be wealthier, and countries with poor rule of law, bad institutions, tend to be poorer. But they say institutions rule, so how did they get there? Well, what they do is that they make use of the fact that geography is arguably exogenous prior to development, integration, or institutions. They bring in some other variables, and then they'll use some statistical methods to try to identify the independent effects of each variable on the level of development. And so once they run the numbers through their statistical software, you see that geography is no longer a strong predictor of wealth. The trade openness is no longer a positive predictor of wealth, but the institutions remain a strong positive predictor of wealth. The good institutions correlate with higher levels of economic development and weaker institutions with lower levels of economic development. A very similar paper is that of Oswald, Johnson, and Roberts in 2001. It's actually an earlier paper involving Subramanian and Trevi. This is one of the most well-cited papers in economics, 14,000 citations, which is more than most departments have here in one paper. They make an argument about institutional quality having to do with colonialism. So this is institutional quality in the post-colonial world. They argue that when European colonists came to different areas of the world, that depending on their initial mortality rates, they either settled or did not settle. And where they settled, they set up good institutions, and where they did not settle, they set up extractive institutions that were just there to take away natural resources that were more exploited of the population. They argue that those early institutions influenced present-day institutions, which influenced present-day performance. So in the paper, they show first a correlation between settler mortality and then the quality of institutions, which they are measuring as the likelihood that the government takes away property, the expropriation risk. And so where lots of settlers died, institutional quality in the present day is low. Where there is lower settler mortality, and so settlers in Europe were more likely to stay, there's higher institutional quality. And then they show that this institutional quality correlates with level of development. Highest institutional quality, the wealthiest countries, lower levels of institutional quality with less wealthy countries. And then they show that that is a result that is robust to different statistical specifications. And so they don't use institution rule the way that Roderick, Subramanian, and Trevi did, but they are making that argument for sure. Oswald, Johnson, Roberts. This is a very general measure of institutions. So Osmo and some of his other work has tried to unbundle institutions to make us thinking about which institutions in particular matter. Still very broad. This is still not getting down to is it a good tax collection agency or a good customs agency? But they divide institutions into the categories of property rights institutions and contracting institutions. The countries might either be performing well at protecting property rights, or they might be performing well at protecting individual contracts. And what Osmo and Johnson find is that the property rights institutions are what predicts development more strongly in contracting institutions. And to come back to accountability here, it's property rights institutions that let people hold the government accountable for inappropriate action. So good property rights institutions mean that people understand ownership in such a way that they can hold the government accountable for violating ownership rights and otherwise enforce accountability. That's government. And then in response to the earlier question, I was talking about democracy as a meta institution, a meta accountability institution. And so we can think of democracy as providing this opportunity for citizens to get rid of governments that perform poorly in the sense that they're corrupt, in the sense that they're making bad policy decisions, or in the sense that they're not protecting the institutions that people find valuable. So if democracy provides an overall accountability mechanism that addresses these things, then we should see better economic performance under democratic rule, we see under non-democratic rule. Osmo and co-authors, again, have looked at this. So starting with the raw data, they take all the countries in the world that have experienced a non-democratic period and a democratic period, and they look to see how economic growth changed after the moment of democratization. In the descriptive data, after a period of non-democratic rule and a transition to democracy, growth is actually lower on average for a period of time. But then it begins to increase. And so in the long run, democratization produces more economic growth, more economic output. But in the short run, it maybe doesn't appear that way. When they process this data through statistical models, they find more evidence that actually there are immediate benefits to democracy. So the GDP per capita begins to increase immediately after democratization. Or here in this model, where they process the data to make better comparisons between the non-democratic period and the democratic period, in the lead up to democratic transition, economic growth is often poor, and then we get a moment of democratic transition, and after that moment of democratic transition, economic growth accelerates. So Osmo and co-authors here showing that this meta institution of democracy might be very good from an economic growth perspective. They try to explore the specific mechanisms through which democracy might be having this effect. And they're looking at some of the things in the solar growth model. So log of investment is investment in physical capital. Here's the A term for the solar growth model, under total factor productivity or technology. Then they look to see, does democracy promote economic reform? Does it promote increased trade? Does it lead to more taxation? Does it improve human capital, the L term in the solar growth model in terms of primary or secondary school enrollment? Does it decrease child mortality? And then what's the relationship between having a democracy and levels of political stability? And so they're going to show us the effect of democracy. This is a coefficient from a statistical regression, and this is the calculation of the effect over time. they surprisingly find null results for total factor productivity, and actually democracy does not improve this most important part of the delivery model. That was a big surprise finding in this article. On the other hand, they find that democracy does encourage investment in physical capital, that it makes governments more likely to reform, that it increases the taxes that governments are collecting, that improves school enrollment, that democracy reduces child mortality, and that democracies are less likely to experience instability or civil unrest. So despite the surprising finding here with regard to total factor productivity, Upload and co-authors find a lot of positive relationships between democracy and some of these immediate causes of economic growth that might explain this long-term trend where democracy is encouraging economic development. We pause again for questions. That's yeah, it didn't the stars is standard error in their case to just divide that too. I'm saving it.
The traffic that you were having the previous one, the table, so I think the previous, yeah, this one, that the bureaucracy is not, having, I think it's not related to the, primary school enrollment and secondary.
It is. Again, they haven't put the stars here, the standard error, and something in the third of that, half of that. So those are both statistically significant conventional. Yeah, the two things that aren't significant are total factor productivity, and then it's got a surprising negative sign. So that's a big surprise from this paper. And then trade is 9% more of the democracy, which maybe that might be a surprise as well.
What the indicator of democracy here? The indicator of democracy.
I don't
So have the
yeah.
negative relationship with the law of it is the FP's technology.
Yeah, total factor productivity.
Yeah. Have the negative impact.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what the indicator of democracy that we was in this study?
Yeah, so they for this study they created their own indicator. I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, no, it's not indicator of democracy. Democracy that used in this study.
But they created their own for the study, and so I don't remember the details of it, right? Because there's a huge debate on how to best measure democracy, and so some people make a strong argument for scales, like polity scale is perhaps the most common measure of democracy. So that measures constraints on the executive, it measures participation, and it measures democracy and autocracy separately. You combine those into a single scale. Other people argue that democracy is either yes or no, it's 0 to 1 variable. And so the Chase-Luganti and Freeland's definition of democracy, drawing on Adam Shaporsky's work, is that you have a democracy if there's multi-party competition, if the legislature is popularly elected, if the chief executive is either popularly elected or elected indirectly by a popularly elected legislature, and then they require that there's been a turnover in power to classify a country as democratic. So I don't remember in this paper what.
We have a democracy index.
Yes,
Yeah, we have democracy index. Democracy index is become worse and worse. Not better and better than getting worse. Yeah, we're so Yeah, it is meant that it is not free to the people to set something to the government.
Yeah, I think they don't use index because they want to talk about a specific year of transition. So I think they use 0-1. You're either Democratic or you're not.
Do they use policy before? The, yeah, so we get the policy characteristic and transition from 1,800 until 2013 by Martin G. Marshall. They use policy one.
I don't remember, I don't remember, but I think they did some new coding of the data. And then because they're so focused on a year of transition, I don't think they use an index. I think they use the dummy variable, 0.
Tell me why don't see demography.
Transitions.
Yeah, translation.
And so you can do that with poly. With the poly measure, people will often say, okay, 6 means you're Democratic, 6 or above means you're Democratic, or 6 means you're not. But they're definitely, it's definitely their own measures. It's not just a poly or just the one that people use now is the varieties of democracy, or VDEM. It's not VDEM. It's something more rich.
What country as his study? What country as a his study?
This is based on the average of how many other countries are in their study. So
Yeah.
169 different countries. So the last section of this talk is trying to think about the incentives that citizens actually have to hold governance accountable. So I showed you some evidence that better information can improve government service delivery, right? That if there's more newspapers, people have more information, we see governments giving more things to people that we think people might want. Money for their schools, money or food in the event of disasters, and then better budgetary performance. I showed you some studies that tell us good institutions, particularly property rights, promote economic development. And then I showed you this one study that argues that democracy can promote economic development. One element of the underlying accountability story in all of these results is that people are actually acting to hold poorly performing politicians, poorly performing governments accountable, or at least that the governments or politicians are sufficiently scared that people might act, that they improve their performance. Do people always do this? Well, certainly not. And so our question is, under what conditions are people more likely to act in a way that brings about this set of outcomes? And this will come back to some of the issues raised earlier about can people really accept what the government is doing?
Excuse me, sir, please, at the very beginning, yes. I highlighted about the evidence related to the democracy promote economic development. I think this is not a fact in Indonesia. For example, we can compare between Orde Baru with this regime today. And Orde Baru, led by President Jokowi at that time, people said that Orde Baru not a democracy, that's authority. But why at that regime, economic growth reached 7 to 8% per year. But not today. People say that today Indonesia is open and open democracy, but why economic growth become down and down?
Yeah, so these are on average results.
Yeah, so that's why my question in both countries as a case study in these reasons, because not a fact in Indonesia.
Yeah, I mean, so we could go back to the data and allow specific countries and look at their growth trajectories. The question, I guess the way that I would frame the question for comparing Indonesia during the New Order, comparing contemporary Indonesia, is how to think about the right counterfactuals in both time periods. And so, what country should we be comparing Indonesia to today in order to think about the post-New Order growth and what it could be versus what it is? One paper that does this is Tom Lipinski, and I forget his co-author's name, but they did a synthetic control study of the effects of the Big Bang decentralization in Indonesia on economic output. This is published in the Journal of East Asian Studies. And so synthetic control methods compare one unit that's treated to an imagined counterfactual unit that's created statistically. And they find, I believe, that there's sort of a small bump to economic growth in Indonesia from decentralization. And they do that using that particular method, which is one way that we can think about these comparisons. So if we want our citizens, if we want our voters, if we want people in a country to hold politicians accountable for their performance, there's a long chain of things that people have to do cognitively in order to accomplish that. And so we have some reality of what performance has been, how well has the economy performed, how well are children getting educated, how well is the healthcare system performing. We have people's perceptions of that performance, and then people attribute responsibility for their perceptions of performance to particular actors, and then they might make a decision to vote based on that attribution. So only if all of these things are accomplished do we actually get to performance-based voting, what we would think of as voting for accountability. In terms of the relationship between the reality of performance and people's perceptions, we already talked about information being an obstacle. Getting information is costly. The citizen really wants to know what has the government done, how well is the government performing, that they really need to invest in getting that information. Information can be uneven over time or across space. The one finding that we know is that the media likes to cover the economy when it's doing bad and say, oh, people are unemployed, the economic growth rate is down. When the economy is doing good, you don't read about it so much in the media. And so people get different information under different conditions. Voters will get that different information depending on where they live, what they do. And then people interpret information based on their priors, and people have cognitive biases. So interpreting information about a government that I like, I'm going to put it in a good light. I'm going to think that that information is positive or that it's not bad as it seems to be. Interpreting information about a government that I don't like, I'm likely to view that information is negative. So we have cognitive biases. If we're trying to get back to performance reality, that these perceptions that might be different from an objective reality. Once people have formed some type of perception, there's now a question of who do they attribute responsibility to for that performance that they perceive. So this is the question of, is it the national government? Is it the Kabupaten government? Is it not the government at all? And so voters vary the extent to which they attribute performance outcomes, economic growth, service delivery to government at all. They vary the extent to which they attribute performance outcomes to specific parts of the government. And it varies in predictable ways with people's characteristics. So some people are more sophisticated consumer of political information is more likely to understand which part of the government is actually responsible for something, able to distinguish, for instance. They will vary in the extent to which they attribute performance outcomes to particular governments. This is the same motivated reasoning. If I like the government and I hear about good things, I'm likely to say the government did those good things. If I dislike the government and I hear about bad things, I'm likely to blame that government that I don't like for those outcomes. Then do people actually vote based on this attribution of responsibility? So voters can weight different things, their voting decision. So how much does a voter care about economic growth relative to broader ideological issues that they care about, or other kinds of policy issues? We won't see performance-based voting if voters care less about economic performance than they care about something else that government does or can't deliver. And this may vary across elections, and then another important thing to keep in mind is that despite what economic models might say, voters are not atomized decision makers, but rather tend to make decisions based on what they think that other people are going to do. So I want to show you two pieces of evidence, one having to do with this idea of voters coordinating when they're going to punish. And then another that has to do with voters' general level of attentiveness to what the government is doing. This is work from Italy, John Golden and Hill, who noticed that legislators in Italy tend to get charged with corruption. And up until the date of their study, up until the legislature that ended in 1994, about half of all members of parliament in Italy have been charged with corruption. I mean, 50%. But what John Golden and Hill discovered is that those legislators charged with corruption, the black bars, were as likely to get reelected as those legislators who were not charged with corruption. In the very first parliament, they were actually much more likely to get reelected. This only changed in 1994 when there was a major corruption scandal called the Clean Hands scandal. And finally, in this legislature, those members of parliament who have been charged with corruption are now less likely to get reelected than those members of parliament who had not been charged with corruption. Although you'll note that nobody was likely to get reelected. There were huge drops in the re-election rates overall. What John Golden and Hill argued happened in Italy in 1994 was because of this large corruption scandal, voters knew that other voters were going to vote based on corruption, and therefore they coordinated their votes together. This is just showing that same finding that corruption doesn't matter, corruption doesn't matter, corruption doesn't matter, corruption doesn't matter. Finally, corruption matters in this one legislation, the 11th Italian legislature. And so they say that it's based on information. What the media was doing at that time was to really start reporting on this huge scandal and start reporting on corruption in a way that it hadn't been previously. And so the facts that the media was reporting meant that voters considered this an important issue, and therefore newspapers again matter less these days because nobody reads newspapers anymore. But newspapers mattering that where people have exposure to newspapers and there was a community charged with corruption, that those were the members of parliament who were particularly likely to be voted out of office. So here in the high corruption context in Italy, we only see this one moment of voters really mobilizing around corruption, starting to pay serious attention to corruption allegations. And John Golden and Hill argue that this is a result of voters needing to have the confidence that other voters were also going to act in the same way in order to remove corrupt politicians from office. Another aspect of having citizens monitor governments and hold governments accountable is that citizens might be more inclined to do this when they feel government's impositions on them. The fiscal contract argument is that people have more of a sense of entitlement to goods and services produced by governments, have more incentives to monitor a government, and have more incentives to hold a government accountable when they are being taxed by that government. So in the United States, every year we fill out this big nasty form, 1040 form, to pay our taxes. Every American household does this, that people who are temporarily residing in the United States do this, and we get a very clear sense of how much money the government is taking from us that year. And this has helped Americans develop an identity as taxpayers. And so Americans therefore complain a lot about taxes. And if they don't like what the government is doing, or if they think that the government is performing poorly, those complaints are very often connected to that identity as tax-paying citizens. So Americans, in other words, very much like to invoke this fiscal contract and say, I'm a taxpayer, I fund the government, I have a right to tell the government what to do, I have a right to hold the government accountable. What we've seen in the literature then is the identification of a number of scenarios in which the fiscal contract might be undermined. This is the idea of the political natural resource curse, that in places where there's natural resource wealth, and therefore the government operates based on natural resource revenues and less based on taxation, there will be less monitoring of what government officials are doing. There will be less likelihood of these accountability relationships being realized. So Michael Ross, in his work on the resource curse, for instance, shows that we're likely to see lower levels of democracy. Here I have fully indicated that this is the polity measure of democracy being used in places where there's oil wealth being extracted or mineral wealth being extracted. And in those types of countries, the level of democracy is lower. This is evidence of this political natural resource curse. Carlos Giordatoni has shown this subnational level, so thinking about intergovernmental grants, money coming from the central government and going to subnational governments, thinking about that as a resource curse kind of dynamic, looking at data from Argentina, that in those places that are receiving more central government transfers, local democracy is poor. And this is Giordatoni's own measure of subnational democracy in Argentina. A very similar paper by Royal and co-authors using data from Brazil. And in particular, they take advantage of the fact that the Brazilian government essentially provided them with an experiment that the federal government sends monies to Brazilian municipalities, and that amount of money changes in a discontinuous fashion at certain population thresholds. This allows Royal and her co-authors to compare those cities that just missed out on getting more money to those cities that did get more money. And so do we see poorer governments, poorer institutions in those cities that are getting bigger central government grants? And yes, we do. We see more corruption, that municipalities that just barely got more money from the central government compared to municipalities that just barely got a little bit less, more likely to be corrupt by two different measures of corruption there, more likely to have more money involved in corruption, and then more likely to have worse political competition. That in those municipalities that are getting larger amounts of central government grants, the challengers who run against incumbent politicians are less likely to have gone to college. They have fewer years of schooling overall, and therefore they lose elections. The incumbents are more likely to win in these places, getting larger grants from the central government. Central government grants function like a resource curve. Foreign aid can also function like a resource curve, that money coming in from international donors can replace the need of governments to tax. And then these governments that receive foreign aid stay in power longer. So this is an interesting work from Faisal Ahmed, who studied the 1970s and looked at how increasing oil prices allowed Middle Eastern foreign aid donors to send more money to countries around the world. They primarily targeted Muslim majority countries. So as the price of oil gets higher, Muslim majority countries get more foreign aid. And then those increases in foreign aid, which are accompanied by increases in remittances of labor, make it less likely that the government will turn over. It makes it more likely that the incumbent government will stay in power. Nicholas Eubank does a similar study looking at Somalia, where he identifies the facts that the international community has only recognized the government in Mogadishu as a legitimate government, whereas in Puntland and Somaliland, independent governments that are not internationally recognized have formed. And the one in Somaliland has asserted its sovereignty over this territory. The one in Puntland said, well, eventually it will be part of Somalia again. The Somaliland said, we want to be an independent country. The Somaliland government, however, gets no foreign aid because it's not recognized by the international community as a legitimate government. All the foreign aid goes to Mogadishu. So what Eubank does in this study is to point out that the government in Somaliland has had to tax its citizens, it had to develop its own revenue sources, and therefore he argues that that has led to more state development and has led to more responsiveness by the Somaliland governments to people within Somaliland. So here's the things that I've talked about today. Talked about institutions, including democracy, promoting economic growth. But I've argued just now that citizens need to be willing to use those institutions in order to hold governments accountable, in order to reach the promises of democracy and institutions. I've shown you some reasons just now why citizens might not engage in accountability-focused voting. And therefore, the conclusion here is that citizen engagement really is key to creating accountable governments and to reaping the economic benefits of accountable governments. Thank you very much.
Okay, from where, because our topic, okay, and
I'm okay to say it.
Interesting topic today. The last one that I'm really interested on the this natural this I mean, how do you think about it's been said in some of the lecture here the problem of the law. It came from the weakness of our law, which is actually that was becoming the main reason why government aid is not aid and foreign aid are giving and supporting for the illegal because our law is really weak and the trying to like analyze the national, the local, like Prodi, and then and then from national to the residency really concerning the meaning of sanction and how to implement.
So it's becoming a natural person for us. And still, I'm saying that I'm waiting for democracy also. Since should be the democracy or should be supporting the parliament, supporting us and making this implemented. There is no end because the driving is given from the government. Say that they are fighting for the upgrade of democracy, the democracy. Becoming a problem for a country like us, a huge country for us, having a natural resource, a huge natural resource. So is there any previously research concerning how the labor law can be disturbing the
Yeah.
driving democracy of it?
Yeah, you touched on a number of topics there. So there's some really good researches, I'm sure you're aware, about logging, legal logging in Indonesia using satellite data, and talking in part about how the creation of new districts for Mbata that is increase in legal logging, right? And that there could be a few explanations for why that's happening, political competition or new unique regulations in brand new districts. And so that's certainly a problem. And then I anecdotally have heard that the forestry ministry has a lot of problems with corruption. And that's an issue as well. And then you touched on something that I find very interesting. I haven't investigated this in any systematic way. My impression is that the DPR passes very general laws and then delegates to the ministries to really write the implementing regulations that are going to mean anything. And I don't necessarily think that's a normatively bad system, but there do seem to be trade-offs in that, right? And particularly from the accountability perspective, because then the real regulations that matter are being created one step further away from the people who might be affected by that. In terms of ideas, I'm not sure what the state of the art in the literature says about implementing good natural resource management. I guess my instinct going back to those early papers is that it is an area where we maybe want to rethink the benefits of decentralization. Right? But I think decentralization has a lot of benefits. But there might be actually a particular issue with natural resource management if those local governments that are empowered do not have a sufficient interest in protecting the natural.
Yeah, it's forward in the protections because even the sanction would be implemented from the national where the and enforcement is came from the government. So it's becoming the weakness of the involved the decentralization. Sometimes the writing looking from the parliament. So many huge people requests for us from or other students of us. We have colleagues here also. We have serving meetings.
I give some give the have the different opinion about the key to economic growth.
I want relations students. Not necessarily.
Maybe you know about the topic, what are the consequences of conflict in the future should become legal? What is the answer?
The two is bad. Yeah. So if we think of democracy as introducing accountability, then the results from the automobile paper or the absence of democracy is holding back economic growth. I agree that we can look at particular cases and try to argue whether that's true, but that is the on average results. In terms of more localized accountability failures, I think the evidence that I've shown is not directly about economic growth. But again, I think it's indicative of what is happening with economic growth. So that the localized accountability failures have more to do with service delivery. If we think that governments are failing on service delivery, that should have negative consequences for economic growth, because as a local government, people will be less inclined to live there and might outline rates, or it means that people are not being as well educated or it's not living as healthy lives as they could be if the service delivery is poor, and that should have negative consequences for them.
Masa dosennya tulisnya diskusinya sama bapak ibu bersama batch, diskusinya sama bapak ibu tentang bisnis.
Teman-teman Indonesia Indonesia your first as with bahasa very important.
Jangan diskusi sama bisnis teman-teman.
Jadi dalam kesempatan apa ya, di negara yang perekonomiannya tinggi cenderung memiliki indeks kualitas bisnis yang lebih tinggi juga. Nah, jadi
Ekonominya itu yang
kalau bukan
apa indikator ekonomi tinggi itu apa? Pertumbuhan ekonomi. Oleh bapak ibu Indonesia tinggi.
jadi cenderung memiliki, yang saya baca itu cenderung memiliki indeks kualitasnya bagus juga. Nah, sehingga
About the quality of growth.
jadi sehingga apa ya?
Indeks ekonomi yang tinggi pada growth cenderung have the high quality. What the quality?
Kualitas apa?
Life
apa ya, negara yang memiliki pertumbuhan ekonomi yang tinggi cenderung memiliki kualitas institusi yang tinggi juga.
Indonesia
high
quality.
Saya melihat apa ya, dua variabel endogen itu saling mempengaruhi. Nah, jadi bagaimana kita cara mengestimasi sehingga hasil yang kita dapatkan itu tidak bias. Karena kan saling mempengaruhi. Jadi kan kita masih hitung apakah institusi yang mempengaruhi ekonomi atau ekonominya mempengaruhi institusi yang sama.
Tadi udah jelas that institusi have a big impact to the economic growth. Hasilnya kan gitu.
Yeah, so I mean both the
key word to economic growth, one of keyword is institution. But I refuse with the term of institution. I agree with institutional, not institution.
just run through
It is a different meaning about the institution. Lembaga dengan lembaga itu juga.
taken on with the Douglas North.
Yeah.
Yes, so I mean, what this literature does is it tries to find exogenous variables, instrumental variables that may be causing a change in institutions without causing a change in growth, and then that lets us statistically identify from institutions to grow. I think Roderick, Subramanian, and Trevi are a little embarrassed by the title of the paper these days, because it indicates too much confidence. And then this cellular mortality instrument, in order to believe that that is helping us identify the effect of institutions on level of development, we have to believe that there's no other relationship from cellular mortality to level of development, the exclusion restriction. And I think that's a very hard assumption to believe, because the same diseases that killed the European settlers have an effect on the local population as well. So, from my mind, there's been surprisingly little critique of Osamoglou, Johnson, and Robinson on those grounds. They do try to respond to that critique in the paper. They anticipated it and they react to it. But all of that's to say that this is really, really hard to identify this arrow only. And so these authors have tried to do some things that statistically should make this relationship less relevant and help us to see only arrow number 8, but none of them are perfect, right? We can't have a high degree of confidence in any of them.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much. Okay, and okay, thank you very much, Prof. Matthew, for the very enlightening and fruitful lecture today. So, because thank you very much for the enlightening lecture and fruitful. I hope that this lecture will be fruitful for everyone. Okay, let's end up this session with Alhamdulillah and the